So good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us on such short notice. My name is Corey Goldstone, and I am the Communications Manager for Voting Rights at the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan election law organization based in Washington, D.C. that has organized today's emergency press call with partners. We will be talking about the biggest voting rights crisis in the United States, the effort by Georgia lawmakers to restrict voting access on many fronts. We have a diverse group of speakers scheduled to talk today, each representing different constituencies that are harmed by the legislation under discussion. In addition to speakers who can provide context to understand the national pattern that Georgia's actions exemplify. Each speaker will offer brief remarks and then we'll open it up for questions. This program is being recorded. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box as soon as they come to mind. If you could include your name, your organizational affiliation, and to which speaker the question should be directed, that would be great. Today's speakers are Aklima Kondakar, Georgia State Director at All Voting is Local. Caleb Jackson, Legal Counsel, Voting Rights at Campaign Legal Center. Dana Lloyd, Program Director at Georgia Advocacy Office. Galen Tootle, First Vice President at the National Federation of the Blind, Georgia. Michael Kling, Associate Director of Law and Policy at the Voting Rights Lab. And Poi Winachakal, Staff Attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund. After the program, if you'd like to ask additional questions, please email me at media@campaignlegal.org if you'd like to set up an interview. Aklima, please take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. And again, my name is Aklima Kondakar, and I am the Georgia State Director at All Voting is Local, a campaign housed at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization where we focus on targeted election administration reform that will remove discriminatory barriers to the ballot. We are here today to discuss dangerous anti-voter policies that harm voters, counties, and leave open the risk for time-consuming and expensive litigation. Nationwide, we're experiencing systematic and coordinated attempts to restrict and prohibit voting rights. Here in Georgia, these feverish attempts have been cloaked in unfounded conspiracies about voting integrity and purportedly easing county burdens. The truth is, these anti-voter policies will only make it harder for people to vote and will overburden county election offices. Simply put, Georgia legislators are supporting voter suppression, and that is inexcusable. Despite overwhelming evidence dismissing false and dangerous conspiracies about our election integrity, the Georgia legislature is determined to push anti-voter bills that restrict the most popular and effective voting methods used in the 2020 election cycle, namely early voting, voting by mail, and drop boxes. Over the 2020 general election alone, nearly 3 million Georgians used early in-person voting, while nearly 2 million Georgia voters used vote by mail to cast their ballots. Drop boxes were approved in 2020 for the first time and offered a free and accessible way for voters to return their absentee ballots, an option that eases pressure on counties and the United States Postal Service. When drop boxes were first introduced over the 2020 cycle, the number of drop boxes statewide sprang up from around 160 over the summer to well over 300 in December, a clear indication that voters appreciate this safe, effective, no cost, and no contact option for ballot delivery. Drop boxes were a necessary addition in 2020 because the global pandemic exacerbated existing election infrastructure problems. Georgia was already short hundreds of voting sites in the aftermath of the 2013 Shelby v. Holder decision, and the Postal Service experienced crippling and unpredictable delays nationwide. Voters needed an option to effectively return their ballots then, and they still need those options now. Unfortunately, the provisions outlined in Georgia's anti-voter bills would eliminate the efficacy of drop boxes altogether by tucking them inside of government buildings during limited early voting hours, making them less accessible to voters. Limiting or eliminating these practical solutions to ballot access problems hurts everyone, but especially marginalized and underrepresented communities. These are direct attacks against communities of color, rural and poor voters, and voters with disabilities. Moreover, these anti-voter bills also come at a tremendous cost to taxpayers and to counties, who will be responsible for paying for these unfunded mandates that will result in less ballot access. Lastly, because these anti-voter bills discriminate against so many groups of voters, the potential for costly litigation is weighing heavily on our already poorly resourced state. It is now up to voters, counties, and advocates and lovers of democracy to stand up and fight against these voter suppression tactics, and we must act now. Thank you for your time. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Caleb Jackson, again, legal counsel of voting rights at Campaign Legal Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aklima. I just want to follow up that and talk a little bit about exactly what's going on in Georgia and what some of these bills would do. Just generally, the onslaught of voter suppression bills in Georgia is following a national trend of legislation being introduced in states across the country to restrict both absentee and early voting, as Aklima said. Georgia legislators point to a general lack of confidence in the integrity of elections since November. However, voters' lack of confidence, as we all know, in the integrity of our elections is the natural result of these very legislators' own claims that the November 2020 election was rife with fraud. These claims have been proven time and time again to be patently false, and we know that this legislation is just smoke and mirrors. There are two major omnibus bills currently making their way through the Georgia legislature, along with several smaller bills. The first omnibus, and the one that has received the bulk of attention, is HB 531, which originated in the House. This bill would limit Black churches' ability to host Souls to the Polls events by shortening the number of Sundays voters can vote during the early voting period. Now, originally, this bill completely eliminated Sunday voting, but after pushback from people on the ground, legislators tweaked the bill to allow for one optional Sunday. Now, this is important because in 2016, the Fourth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals noted that a similar limitation on Sunday voting in a 2013 North Carolina omnibus bill was, quote, and this is directly from the opinion, as close to a smoking gun as we are likely to see in modern times, unquote. The Fourth Circuit also went on to say that this omnibus bill in North Carolina, which limited Sunday voting, quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, unquote. This Georgia bill seeks to do the same, targeting not only African American voters, but other minority voters, voters with disabilities, and older voters who don't have the means to get to the polls. This bill, this House omnibus bill also adds new voter identification requirements, requiring voters to list either their driver's license number or their state issued ID number on their absentee ballot applications. And voters who do not have a driver's license or state ID, which are disproportionately minority voters and voters with disabilities, will be forced to include a photocopy of another form of ID with their absentee ballot application. This bill will also ban all ballots cast out of precinct while simultaneously allowing precincts to be split up just 60 days before an election without proper notification. So what that means is that if a voter's precinct is changed 61 days before the election and they show up to their old precinct not knowing that it has been changed, their vote will no longer count in the state of Georgia. It would also ban Good Samaritans from giving food and water to voters in line, something that we saw, very rapidly or very widespread in Georgia this past election because voters were waiting 4 hours, 8 hours in line. So, Good Samaritans went to give them water, went to give them food, so that they would, not be hungry or not pass out, quite frankly. And this bill would also ban that. SB 241 is the other omnibus bill, and this is the bill in the Senate. This bill would repeal no excuse absentee voting, which was actually passed by Georgia Republicans in 2005. Now, this, I think is one of the clearest examples of how these proposed rule changes are motivated by partisan desires and not motivated by a need to improve election integrity. Because as we know, there is not really a need to improve election integrity. following 2020. The Senate bill would also add the same voter ID requirements from the House bill, but not only to absentee ballot applications, to the absentee ballots themselves. And SB 4241 also includes a provision that targets election-related lawsuits brought by groups like CLC, SPLC, ABLE, that are often, completed or resolved through consent decrees. The Senate bill would prevent that from happening and instead force the legislature to approve any consent decrees or agreements that the state enters into with third parties. On a brighter note, there have been restrictive proposals that have already failed, including a law that would require voters to be 75 to meet the age eligibility requirement for excuse absentee voting instead of 65, which would have been, the highest age requirement in the country. And advocacy groups like ABLE and SPLC and disability rights organizations on the ground in Georgia are continuing to fight and stop these bills from being signed into law. And we at CLC are continuing to monitor the situation, provide our support, and watch and hopefully stop these bills from passing the Georgia legislature and eventually being signed into law.
Thank you, Caleb. Dana, you are next.
Thank you so much. My name is Dana Lloyd, and I am the director of our program for protection and advocacy for people experiencing developmental disabilities in Georgia. And the Georgia Advocacy Office appreciates this opportunity to provide these comments regarding the various legislation proposed in both houses of Georgia's legislature. The Georgia Advocacy Office is Georgia's appointed protection and advocacy system, and we are deeply concerned about the impact this proposed legislation will have on Georgians with disabilities. People with disabilities need greater access to voting and civic engagement opportunities, not less. As a recipient of federal Help America Vote Act funding, Georgia Advocacy Office is dedicated to ensuring people with disabilities have access to free, equitable, accessible, and independent elections. Georgia's no excuse absentee voting policy eliminates many accessibility and transportation barriers for people with disabilities. As a result of these sound policies put in place to expand access to absentee voting, record numbers of voters with disabilities cast their vote in 2020. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission's study on disability and voting accessibility in the 2020 elections documented a significant reliance on absentee voting as the primary voting method for people with disabilities, with 74% of voters choosing to vote absentee in the most recent elections. Given this, any attempt to restrict access to this method of voting will dramatically impact the voting rights of people with disabilities. Of primary concern are the proposals within both HB 531 and Senate Bill 241 that Caleb mentioned that limit access to absentee voting to people with physical disabilities, which disenfranchises people with other disabilities. In the study cited above, only 48% of people with disabilities who voted by mail indicated a physical disability, meaning over half of people included experienced another disability. Voting by mail has proven to be a safe and accessible way to exercise the right to vote. Exclusion of people with disabilities based upon the type of disability creates an unnecessary barrier to voting and evidences discrimination based upon disability. It is also important to note that the bills being proposed act in concert with other legislation and will have the effect of eliminating most alternatives to reporting to a polling place on a given day to cast a ballot. These limits to early voting, reduced availability of drop boxes, elimination of mobile voting sites, and ID requirements all have the impact of disenfranchising voters with disabilities throughout Georgia. These proposals create an overlapping burden that narrows the opportunity for voters with disabilities to vote. Having access to extended hours of early voting, a 3-week voting period, and the opportunity to vote on Saturday and Sunday as early voting days creates more opportunities for people with disabilities to participate in civic life. Having a variety of opportunities to cast a ballot facilitates equal access to the electoral process and assists in eliminating barriers such as transportation and work or family commitments. Accessible ballot drop box locations provide opportunities for the disability community to experience fewer barriers to voting. These secured boxes allow people with disabilities to return their absentee ballots without the added complexity of a post office visit or the cost of postage or environmental obstacles such as lack of accessible parking, appropriate curb cuts, or poorly trained poll workers. Mobile voting precincts expand opportunities for people living in congregate facilities to fully participate in the electoral process. Many residents may be unable to leave the facility and are often under the age of 65 and thus not eligible to request an absentee ballot under the proposed legislation. Mobile voting sites offer solutions for many Georgians with disabilities to remain engaged in the electoral process. Finally, requiring a Georgia ID to request an absentee ballot has the potential to disproportionately impact the disability community, as many people with disabilities do not have a driver's license and are less likely to have a state-issued ID compared to voters without disabilities. For many Georgians whom the PNA supports, obtaining an ID often requires navigating inaccessible systems and administrative barriers that require time, money, and additional support. In short, the effect of this proposed legislation imposes restrictions that make the central activity of a democratic society less accessible to voters with disabilities. Throughout history, Americans have fought to expand, protect, and ensure the right to vote is honored. Every eligible Georgian should be able to cast their vote and have it counted. If passed, this legislation will move Georgia backwards, making it harder to vote and creating additional barriers for people with disabilities. It is imperative to recognize that these multiple proposals intersect with each other and create an undue burden that restricts the right of voters with disabilities to freely and equitably cast their ballot and threatens the freedom to vote for all of us. I'd like to pass it on to Galen Tootle from Walton Options.
Thanks, Dana. Good morning. My name is Galen Tootle. I am the first vice president of the National Federation of the Blind, and I also serve as an independent living advocacy coordinator here at Walton Options in Augusta, Georgia. I am a blind registered voter, and a lot of the things that they've already highlighted were some of the things that I was going to talk about. So I'm going to basically focus on the inaccessibility of a process that was already inaccessible for the blind voter as it stands. The absentee ballot process itself is totally inaccessible for those of us who are blind or visually challenged. What these other layers will do is just, as my co-companions have already said, it will just exacerbate a process that has been inaccessible from the start. We believe that we should be able to vote securely and independently in free and fair elections. The absentee voting process as it stands right now in the state of Georgia is not accessible for us as blind folk. The voting process itself, where you go into the precinct and vote, is not accessible for blind voters as it stands. The legislature, the Secretary of State's office, they were aware of this prior to this onslaught of voter suppression bills, and we were promised that they would address that, and it has not been addressed. So these other, this onslaught of these voter suppression bills, it will simply just take us all the way out of a process that hasn't been accessible for us from the very beginning. Some of the initiatives in House Bill and Senate Bill 241 and 531 speaks to mean-spiritedness, and we have to call it for what it is. We are being locked out of a process that is constitutionally mandated simply because of a lie. As Caleb so eloquently said earlier, there's no proof of fraudulent elections here in Georgia. So what we have to understand in the disability community, especially those of us who are blind, who are already locked out of a system as it relates to being able to vote independently, is that these things will bring on more litigation. They will also eliminate a certain sector of the voting population, for we know that when it comes to disabled folk and Black and poor low-income population, that there's already a sense of isolation. There's already a sense of, well, the system is not going to work for me. simply because of semantics and demographics. So it is important that we fight for the accessibility piece. And as it stands right now, blind voters are on the fringe of being totally pushed out of the system. A couple of the items that really brings me to this place is, as I sit and I look at the bill, who would sit down and say, well, we don't want them to have any water or any snacks, and we know that we are increasing the potential for lines at the polls. That's a barrier that could almost be inaccessible for some of the people in my community. So when we talk about the accessibility rollbacks, accessibility was already rolled back for us as blind voters. And we believe that through alliances, through situations such as this, where we get a chance to tell our stories and give examples of how we go to the polls and our machines are set up for us to use. And then we stand 2 and 3, 4 hours sometimes in line waiting on someone to get the machines up so that we can use them. The fact that we as blind voters, we have to go to only certain machines that are set up in the precinct so that we can vote on them, which brings about ostracizing and working on our mental worth. We just feel that the process is inaccessible from the start. And the absentee ballot process is only the beginning. The drop boxes, that was a great thing for us. I grew up in a small rural community, and in that community there was only one drop box. So in communities such as those where there's a lack of transportation and we depend on support system, that's just another barrier. So in essence, we look at these bills as being totally, not only are they voter suppression, anti-voting, but they're also attacking our personal right to exercise our constitutional duty. So again, inaccessibility rollbacks, we were already outside of the loop. So we thank you for this opportunity, because whereas I could talk on and on about the different initiatives in there, I think we just simply need to talk about the spirit of, and let's do these type of calls so that we can get our stories out there and get the public involved, because it's going to take all of us. It's going to take corporate people. It's going to take everyday grassroots people. It's going to take the guys like you out there in the audience who took the time out to come in and listen to our stories to get it done. And we believe that we will be able to do this because we have a motto in our community that says, nothing for us without us. And we will be here and we will continue to tell our stories. And we thank you for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Galen. Good afternoon. My name is Michael King, and I'm an Associate Director of Law and Policy with Voting Rights Lab. And I'm here to talk about a few highlights from a fiscal analysis we released a few weeks ago to try and estimate the cost these bills could have, particularly for county election budgets. So Georgia law requires the General Assembly to request an official fiscal note on any bill that would have a significant impact on state revenues or expenditures. And despite numerous requests from legislators and voting rights advocates, no fiscal note has yet been prepared for either of these omnibus election bills. So we published a fiscal analysis in consultation with partner organizations who have expertise in election law and voting rights. And we found that these bills could end up costing Georgia taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. I'll also note we've worked with groups like Leadership Now and others to raise the voices of groups like Black Votes Matter to ensure that the business community understands that democracy and access to the ballot are critical to having a stable democracy. So to just touch on a few of the costs we found, I'll begin with the absentee restrictions. HB 531 and SB 241 both impose new ID requirements on absentee voters, both when they request and return their ballot, as some of the speakers have noted already. And SB 241 goes even further by repealing no excuse absentee voting altogether. These absentee restrictions represent some of the biggest changes to Georgia's voting laws in over 15 years and would absolutely necessitate a comprehensive statewide voter education campaign. These changes would also affect voter behavior, leading to more people showing up and voting in person and applying for more free state IDs in order to do so. State systems would also need to be updated to accommodate the new verification systems and provide more secure storage for protected personal information, as voters would be required some of them would be sending their personal, like copies of their photo ID or passport through the mail. And combined, we believe these new absentee voting restrictions alone will cost somewhere between $6.8 and $12 million. And some of these costs will be recurring on an ongoing basis. Next, some of the changes to drop boxes. HB 531, as was noted, requires all drop boxes to be personally monitored by on-site staff at all times they're available during the advanced voting period. And we estimate staffing costs alone could exceed $1 million per election cycle and would be primarily a county expense. We also took a look at the sunk costs of some of the drop boxes that were purchased for the 2020 election cycle. I think over 300 were purchased last year. And due to the restrictions put in place in HB 531, a number of these will likely go unused due to the new restrictions. So we estimate that cost to be around $76,000 in just sunk costs alone. A couple other notable miscellaneous costs to note are HB 531 bans counties from accepting supplemental grant funding from organizations seeking to improve voter access and ensure successful election administration. Had this ban been in place in 2020, we estimate that counties would have had to forego roughly $33 million in support funding. And as I think was noted earlier, litigation costs are estimated to be up to about $12 million, including both the cost of defending these laws in court, but also potentially plaintiffs' attorneys' fees if the laws are ultimately overturned. That Fourth Circuit case that Caleb mentioned earlier had substantial plaintiffs' attorneys' fees that the state of North Carolina had to pay out, and similar recent rulings in Texas as well. So I'll stop there, but I'll flag that the analysis identifies a number of other potential costs that could result from these bills, and I'd be happy to share out the complete write-up with anyone who's interested. So with that, I'll turn it over to Poi at SPLC.
Thanks, and thank you again for having me. I really just enjoyed hearing from all of these different perspectives, and I hope those on the phone or on the Zoom call do as well. I'll be brief in my remarks. My name is Poi Winachakal. I am a staff attorney with the SPLC Action Fund. The SPLC Action Fund works in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance human rights. What we're seeing in Georgia is the use of dangerous conspiracy theories of voter fraud as an excuse for passing measures that would sharply restrict the freedom of voters to safely and easily cast their ballots. Each individual provision within these bills is designed to make it harder for voters to cast a ballot, whether that is directly or through constraining the resources of counties who administer the elections, so that the counties are unable to keep up with the high turnout rates we saw this election cycle. Therefore, the cumulative effect of HB 531, SB 241, and other single provision bills is clearly to punish voters of color, young voters, and voters with disabilities, and voters from historically disenfranchised communities for their record turnout in 2020, despite the pandemic, and all under the guise of the big lie. As others on this call have already shared, one of the most shameful developments throughout this process has been the bill sponsors' use of the deadly pandemic to abuse their power and rush these bills through without transparency and the proper public input. This entire process indicates the clear and urgent need for federal oversight and passage of laws like the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would prevent the implementation of laws that target voters of color and make voting more difficult. I'll just close by sharing that I know that a lot of attention has been paid to certain provisions of the bill. I get questions like, which provisions are the worst? Which provisions will make it the hardest for voters to cast a ballot or have the biggest effect? I will just say that if you look at the bills that are on the table, everything's on the menu to pass right now. And if you look at the bills, the big ones and the small ones, these will restrict voting at every single stage. You heard from Dana and Galen about absentee voting. You heard from Caleb and Aklima about the drop boxes. You heard from, you heard these stories about absentee ballot voting, drop box voting, early voting, in-person voting, and the immense costs that all of this will have on the system. And I'd like to just emphasize that the cumulative effect of this will be an incredible burden on voters who, especially from historically disenfranchised communities, that would, as Galen put it, effectively disenfranchise them. So with that, I will throw it back to Corey, and I assume we'll get some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Boy. I appreciate it. If anybody has questions, you can email it to me separately or put it in the Q&A box. But to get it started, I wanted to ask about the no excuse absentee voting provision and just see if any of the panelists had a thought on why this has come up now after Georgia Republicans had passed it in 2005. If anybody wants to start with that.
Sure, I'd like to provide some comment there. So Georgia has enjoyed no excuse absentee voting since 2005. As some folks on this call had mentioned already, this is something that received GOP support. But the difference, what we've seen shift in 2020 and in our runoffs in 2021 is that we've seen overwhelming usage of our absentee voting system. And we've seen that cause a political shift throughout the state of Georgia. We know that Secretary of State Raffensperger even enjoyed our no excuse absentee system as he sent so many active voters, over 1 million active voters, absentee ballot applications so that we could request our absentee ballot. So this has been something that has received broad GOP support across the state. And we have only seen this shift to now require an acceptable excuse to request an absentee ballot in the wake of our 2020 and 2021 elections. So I don't think that that is a difficult connection to make, that clearly we're seeing this shift because of turnout and because of the change in the political landscape in Georgia. It is shameful that now we have an additional barrier to ballot access when so many Georgians have enjoyed this system since 2005.
This is Galen. I would just like to piggyback on what Aklima said. We know what it is. The wrong people voted. Too many of the wrong people voted, and that includes our community because, as someone mentioned earlier, we set records as far as participating in the process. We did a real good job of getting out the disability vote, and even though, as I said, the system is certainly not accessible for me in the blind community, but as a whole, the absentee ballot process really did get out the people, and it simply put, the wrong people came out and voted, and they responded by January 6th insurrection, and they continue to perpetuate that mindset so that we can, and these Republican, the Republican legislators, they seem to want to perpetuate that lie. So it's not hard to figure out what's going on. It's certainly not difficult to see who's doing it because it's an in-your-face type thing. But the fact of the matter still remains, we in the disability community and certainly the blind community, we believe that the ADA gives us the right to come in and be able to have equal access to the voting process, be it absentee ballot. I don't like the word no excuse, because it says to me that my blindness is an excuse. So the language of the bill even speaks to the mindset of the folk who are pushing the initiatives. This is an in-your-face type thing. This is a racist type thing. This is voter suppression. And as I often say, we in the disability community, I was under the impression that maybe we were going to just be the collateral damage, but with the way that they do these things now in your face, we were probably part of the intended objective as well.
Thank you so much, Galen, for offering that, and to you, Aklima, too. The next question is about the out of precinct policy. So Caleb touched on this briefly in his remarks, but I think people could benefit from a slightly deeper dive into this. Why are people being punished for mistakenly voting out of precinct? And how does that intersect with the fact that a lot of voter precincts are going to be moved if this bill is passed?
I'll take that one too. If you were to look at the statistics, Black voter participation and poor low-income participation and disabled voting participation, we set records again. One of the things though, and they know this because they have people up there who do the research and crunch numbers and that kind of thing. So they know that in 2020, there were record numbers of Black folk voting, poor people and disabled folk voting. However, the flip side of that also is that a lot of times we don't educate ourselves prior to going to vote. And when I say we, I'm talking about that entire demographic, the poor, the disabled. We don't tend to do it. So a lot of times we'll show up at the wrong precinct. And they know this. As I said, they've already crunched the numbers. So again, it is an in-your-face attempt to disenfranchise a certain portion of the of the voting population. That's my take on that, Corey.
And I'd like to just piggyback off of that to just say that we have not had robust voter education in Georgia to even inform voters about changes to their polling places in real time. We've seen so many locations consolidated, moved at the last minute over 2020, where even if a person wanted to find out about critical changes to their voting site, they would be unable to do that. And if the only option is online and it's not updated online, and you happen to be a rural voter who resides in a place that doesn't have robust internet access, you don't really have a way to get that information. It's really up to the county to do that. It's unfortunate that the Secretary of State's office has not prioritized that. But what I think they are counting on, what legislators especially are counting on, is that people lacking this information will not want to participate, will not be able to participate. And even if they do show up to participate, it's an effective way to make their vote not count.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, someone might say, well, can a voter just leave that precinct and go to the correct precinct once they realize that? But we know that all of these communities we're talking about, whether you're talking about Black communities, whether you're talking about poor communities, whether you're talking about communities with disabilities, do not often have access to cars. So oftentimes people are taking public transportation to their precincts. And it's very difficult to take public transportation to the wrong precinct and then hop back on a bus or a train and take public transportation to another precinct. So this isn't just, it might sound in theory like this isn't really a burden, but this is a huge burden. And like Aklima and Galen have said, they know exactly what they're doing.
And the last thing I'll add, Corey, is that in Georgia during early voting, you can vote at any early voting location. So voters may have had the education that for 3 weeks before an election, I can go anywhere in my county where voting is happening and voting. But then on election day, that's no longer an option, which can be very confusing, along with all the other barriers that Caleb and Galen and Aklima just mentioned. But that's also an issue with the targeted election day precinct really matters part of the legislation.
And to hammer home that point, Corey, not to belabor it, but to hammer it home, again, I grew up in a little small rural area. And for the folk down in my community who are disabled, there's no public transportation. We don't have public transportation, first of all. So we depend on support systems, networks. Well, everybody on here knows that human beings will let you down. So not only do I have to plan my opportunity to go vote, I got to depend on my sister who may have anything that comes up as a human, when you're living, anything can happen. So then I got to morph, I got to reconfigure, figure out how I'm going to get to the poll. So, well, I'm not going, I'm going to get to the point where I'm just not going to worry about that. I got to find somebody who has a wheelchair accessible vehicle. I got to find somebody who's will have time to take me. So when you say it's a small thing, not really, not for my people, because in rural Georgia, we don't get do-overs a lot of times, simply because if we were depending on someone else. We don't have a bus. We don't have a, so yes, it is again, they know what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Galen. Yeah, you had mentioned that, growing up in Glenville, Georgia, small town with less resources, and you told the story about your cousin Barbara and how she uses a wheelchair and has difficulty getting access to a car. And a lot of people like Georgia, they're in hourly jobs, and so the flexibility is a lot less. So
Yes.
I think it's important that people hear that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, in South Georgia, yeah, she planned to just like everyone else, she planned to go vote. Our cousin, who was gonna take her, had a doctor's appointment that came up, so she wasn't able to take her. And she just spoke to just what I said. She got frustrated to the point she just didn't vote, and that should never happen. But with all of these things that they're gonna do, that would certainly put a damper on that. But that needs to be out there, because that's just not in Glenville, Georgia. That's Decatur County, Georgia. That's Bainbridge, Georgia. That's over half of the state of Georgia, actually, because once we get below Macon, the landscape shifts. So that is very critical that we have consistency, that we have concrete things in place so that our people don't have to reconfigure it. And that would certainly put a burden on our people, and ultimately probably push some of them out of off the voting rolls.
All right, thank you. I think that brings us to the conclusion of today's program. It was recorded, so I'll send around a link to that. And if anybody has any follow-up requests for interviews of any of the speakers today, you can email me at media@campaignlegal.org. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.